How's everybody doing? My name is Anthony Brian Logan, and today we got to talk about a San Francisco school that wants to remove Abraham Lincoln from their name. Now, I'm not surprised at all by this. I've seen the writing on the wall for a long time. I've called it years ago. Back, I say 3, 4, 5 years ago, all this Confederate statue removal stuff happened. We got to go to this college campus and remove this person because they were part of the Confederacy. They were a racist. They owned slaves, all this, that, and the third. And when I saw that, I knew it'd only be a matter of time before Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and more were removed for various reasons. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and the rest of them, oh, they were slave owners. So we got to remove them. Let's forget about the fact that George Washington freed us from the Kingdom of Great Britain and started our nation in which we live today back in 1776 with the American Revolution. Let's totally forget about that and just say that he was a racist because he owned slaves and therefore he's a terrible person. Okay, forgetting the fact that they were natives that owned slaves. We'll talk about natives in a little bit. Forgetting the fact that there were blacks that owned slaves. Forgetting the fact that blacks owned slaves not only here but in Africa. Every nation on planet Earth, for the most part, had slaves. The natives themselves had native slaves before the white man came to America. Let's forget all of that. And anybody that was tied to things that were going on back then that were seen as normal, we're going to judge them based on 2020 standards and cancel them. That's what's going on, okay? And unfortunately, there wasn't a real big kickback because people were saying, oh, they were Confederates, they were racist, so what? Go ahead and remove them, put them into a museum. There was minimal kickback. But I was like, wait a minute, if you don't kick back right now, if you just let it go right now, it's going to spiral because the so-called progressives are going to always want to progress to the very next thing. And here we are with the removal of Abraham Lincoln from a high school in San Francisco, California. Now, what was the reasoning? The reasoning, they said, is that black lives did not matter to Abraham Lincoln. Yes, they did say that, and I'll place my source in the description box below. But Abraham Lincoln literally freed the slaves. 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, if you were a state in rebellion, meaning the Confederacy, you were ordered to free your slaves. And the rest of the country freed their slaves shortly thereafter. I think 1865 were when the last slaves were free in the Union because both sides had slaves, but that's a different story. And I won't go down that rabbit hole, so I digress. Both sides of the war had slaves. And I think the last native nation to free their slaves were the Choctaw in 1866. So this was a thing that was spearheaded by the war, number one, and by Abraham Lincoln. Now, the war was not fought necessarily to end slavery, but the war provided the opportunity and the chance to end it. That's what Abraham Lincoln did. Okay. And Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, was a conservative. He was the very first Republican president ever in the US of A, the very first GOP president. Okay, Democrats were around before that and they were slave owners. Kind of funny how that works. We were founded as an abolitionist movement on the right as conservatives, as GOP, but on the left, the Democrats were very much pro-slavery. As a matter of fact, if there were no secession, if there were no breaking away from the Union, the Democrats had no real issue with the slavery. Slavery ended because the first Republican president ever to be in office did it. That's the reality. But apparently, black lives did not matter to Abraham Lincoln. Now, they're going to say, well, he freed the slaves not because he cared about black people. It's because he wanted to keep the Union together. Now, the part about keeping the Union together may have been true. Maybe that's true. It doesn't really matter, though, because at the end of the day, he did it. All right. So that's just the reality. It doesn't matter if he loved, hated, or didn't even care about black people. The point is that he did what the objective of the party was. As an abolitionist movement, he got in there, freed the slaves, and that was the whole point from the very beginning, right? But then they go on to say other things. They go on to try and prove their point about Abraham Lincoln not really caring about black lives. They said he was behind the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway movement. So they were saying since he was in favor of homesteading, which meant you could apply as a citizen or, a citizen that a pending citizen, meaning you might have been part of the Confederacy. As long as you didn't fight against the Union, you were able to apply to get a plot of land out far west. And the whole point was to cultivate it and to improve it. All right. Basically, to expand the U.S. beyond the Mississippi River and to make it better. That was the whole purpose of the Homestead Act. And you were able to get like 120 acres of land. And the issue with that and the Pacific Railway was that you had some conflicts with the natives that were already out there that were claiming pieces of that land for themselves. All right. And they said since he did that, then he didn't care about natives. Well, I thought it was about black lives. Which one is it? So we're just saying Black Lives Matter as a catch-all term. Black could just mean somebody that's not white, including a native person. And speaking about the Native Americans, they had slaves too. All right. Throughout the war, throughout all of that, like I told you just a little while ago, the last slaves in the U.S., or what is now known as the U.S., weren't freed until 1866 in the Choctaw Nation. That means they had slaves throughout the entirety of the war and did not free them until well after the war was over. The war was over in 1865. They didn't free their slaves until a year later. About 6 months to a year later is when they freed their slaves. All right. Also, Trail of Tears, to talk about that whole thing going on. Now, that wasn't Abraham Lincoln. If I'm not mistaken, if I'm wrong, let me know in the comments. But they talk about the Trail of Tears and how natives, they were forced from their lands and they were, forced into Oklahoma, et cetera, so on and so forth. Well, what they don't say in the school books normally is that the natives had slaves and they brought them on the Trail of Tears with them. So we're talking about, oh, native this, native that. Well, the natives weren't angels. Native had slaves too. So if Abraham Lincoln is to be canceled because he did not care about black lives or native lives, why are you trying to protect the natives when they had slaves too? And Abraham Lincoln never had any slaves. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. He was not a slave owning president. He was an abolitionist president that freed the slaves. So if you're going to do some comparing and contrasting between the natives that had slaves and Abraham Lincoln, who did not have slaves ever and who freed the slaves as a president of the U.S., I mean, which one is better than the other? But we're going to put Abraham Lincoln down and raise the natives up. Now, I'm not saying they're better or worse than each other, but judging by their own standards, Abraham Lincoln should be better than the natives. But I almost forgot one part. These people just generally hate white people, period. That's just really what it is. So it doesn't matter. It could be Bill Clinton. If Barack Obama was white, it could be Obama. It could be George W. It could be Abraham Lincoln. It could be JFK. They're going to find something wrong with them. That's generally how that goes. Jimmy Carter, all these guys, they'll find something wrong with them, okay? I saw a school in Portsmouth, Virginia, which is part of where I grew up in Virginia. It's a ghetto, poor city for the most part. They're talking about spending $400,000, $500,000 to change the name of Woodrow Wilson High School because he was tied to segregation. So we're not talking about a slave owner or anybody like that, but because he was tied to segregation and he may have been a quote unquote racist, then that means you got to cancel him. So, I mean, like, what's next? Okay, I saw Thomas Jefferson. He was getting canceled out there in Falls Church, Virginia, which is like Washington, D.C., basically. The guy gave this whole big, long speech. I'll place that in the description box, talking about, oh, according to his words, he shouldn't even be here. And, this is not a political meeting, but I got to put my political viewpoints out there. These people have gone mad. I think Trump derangement syndrome is still raging. The same people will say, Trump didn't win, he lost, and, here's your copium, all this and that and the third, but they still got this latent Trump derangement syndrome. They believe that Trump lost, that Biden won, but they still can't get over Trump. That's what it's all about. So you're going to cancel everything, cancel everybody until there ain't nothing left, until the true vision that they have for the country is realized, until they can shape the country and their vision and their eyes and their mind, then they're going to cancel everything. The start was the Confederate monuments, the Confederate statues, and I called it. It was easy to see what was going on. Anybody could have, Stevie Wonder could have seen it coming a mile away. But I think I'll leave that right there for now. And what say you? Should we cancel Abraham Lincoln because he did not care about black lives, although he literally freed the slaves from bondage? If that's your viewpoint, let me know why in the comments below. Or should we not cancel Abraham Lincoln? Should we not cancel anyone? Here's my take on it. Don't take away any statues. I don't care if they were a slave owner, a slave liberator, if they were in segregation, desegregation. I don't care. Leave everything up. I want all of it to be up. Good, bad, ugly, indifferent, arguable, whatever it is, because I want all of our history to be front row and center. Okay. And I want to have talks about it. I don't want to have things hidden away. Okay. Don't hide statues, and also don't hide things, from books. Don't remove passages. Don't censor things when you're talking about history, because we got to see what was going on and get a full grasp of what was happening. I did not know up until I think maybe this year at 36 years old that the natives had slaves with them on a Trail of Tears. I knew they had slaves, but I didn't know they had them on a Trail of Tears. I'm learning more and more every day about our country, because a lot of things have been hidden away from us in K through 12, even in college. So don't take anything away. Don't hide anything away. Let it all be out there so we can learn from it, take from it that things that are positive, eliminate what's negative, and push forward in a truly progressive way rather than a brainwashed, ignorant, so-called progressive way. But whatever your thoughts are, please let me know in the comments below. And that's all I got to say for this video. If you like what you heard, please comment, rate, share, and subscribe. Peace.